On Primetime Politics, backing a Palestinian bid.
In favor, 143. Against, 9. Abstentions, 25.
The UN General Assembly votes to give the Palestinian delegation full membership, effectively recognizing a Palestinian state. Israel and the U.S. voted against it. Canada did not. Coming up, we'll hear from the UN Ambassador Bob Rae as he explains why Canada chose to abstain. Also, Canadians are not loving their political leaders these days. Our journalist panel will discuss what's behind the dismal polling numbers. And
we think there is the financial flexibility to cope, but there are risks.
The Bank of Canada says the system remains resilient, but challenges like mortgages and credit debt could still have a negative impact on the national economy. We'll examine the warnings and look at what can be done with economist Mostafa Askari. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. The General Assembly of the United Nations voted overwhelmingly on Friday to grant the Palestinian delegation full membership to the global body. The United States vetoed a similar move last month at the UN Security Council, but in the Assembly, 143 countries voted in favor of the Palestinian bid, and only 9 countries voted against it. The nays included the U.S. and Israel, but Canada broke away from its traditional allies by choosing to abstain. Take a listen now to Canada's ambassador to the UN, Bob Rae, as he outlines this country's reasonings.
Mr. President, an immediate ceasefire is urgently needed. Hostages must be released. Rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian relief must be provided to civilians. Israel should refrain from further military operations in Rafah, which are already bringing devastating humanitarian consequences. Canada's approach to this crisis and to this vote today is guided by 3 key principles. The first is that Israel has the right to exist and to defend itself in accordance with international law. Second, that the Palestinian people must be able to realize their right to self-determination. And third, that the protection of civilians everywhere, not just on both sides of this conflict, but in all conflicts everywhere, that protection is paramount and a strict requirement under international humanitarian law. As the General Assembly has considered granting additional privileges for the Palestinian delegation at the United Nations, and recommending that the Security Council reconsider full United Nations membership for Palestine, Canada has decided to abstain today. Let me explain why. We agree with confirming the enhanced participation of Palestinian representatives in the UN. And I must say personally, I have appreciated the flexibility that the Palestinian delegation has shown in finalizing this resolution. We had good, fair, frank, and detailed discussions, and I think they have produced a better resolution as a result. But we still have concerns with this resolution despite best efforts, hence our abstention. It goes too far in determining that Palestinian statehood and a right to full membership has actually, on the ground, in reality, as opposed to in aspiration, that this has actually been achieved. The other fact which we must come to grips with, that Hamas, which many states, including Canada, consider to be a terrorist organization, a view that is totally confirmed by their behavior on October the 7th. It currently controls areas in Gaza, an essential part of the territory of the future state of Palestine. Hamas continues to hold hostages, has yet to lay down its arms or end its violent opposition to the existence of Israel. All Palestinians deserve to be led by a legitimate and representative government without the participation of a terrorist organization. At the same time, the Netanyahu government has made clear in its words and in its actions that it rejects the two-state solution. Illegal settlements and settler violence in the West Bank are growing at alarming rates, often with impunity. We believe there must be continued progress towards Palestinian self-determination, and we will not and cannot afford to give up. It is clear that we must urgently rebuild a credible path to achieving the two-state solution, one that gives hope to both Palestinians and Israelis that they may live side by side in peace, security, and dignity. That process cannot delay indefinitely the creation of a Palestinian state. Canada is prepared to recognize the state of Palestine at the time that is most conducive to lasting peace, and let me make it clear, not necessarily as the last step along that path. There is still work to be done, but Canada's commitment to the two-state solution, including recognition of the state of Palestine when it is appropriate, is very much there. We will also continue to support efforts towards peace and regional stability. We will maximize pressure on Hamas and the Iranian regime, including through sanctions. We will impose sanctions on extremist settlers. We will support strengthening the Palestinian Authority and the introduction of reforms to deliver for Palestinians. We are further committed to supporting the recovery and reconstruction of Gaza in the context of a sustainable peace. The solution also needs to be regional, and it also needs to include the full integration of Israel in the Middle East. Canada will continue working with the international community and will keep at the center of its efforts the need for long-term security guarantees for Israel, as well as the national aspirations of Palestinians. Together, we must redouble our efforts to fully realize the vision that was first articulated by the General Assembly in 1947. We owe it to the Israeli and Palestinian peoples who deserve a brighter future and a sustainable peace. Peace requires, above all, empathy. It requires an understanding of every nation's and every people's search for dignity and for recognition. Let's be very clear. There are many states which still today do not recognize the State of Israel. It has been a member nation of the United Nations since 1948. At the same time, it has taken us a long time to provide Palestinians with the recognition that they deserve to allow them to become a member of not only this organization, but of others. As I've said, that work still rests to be done. But in order to do it, it is going to require a leap of faith and imagination that takes us past some of the words we've heard spoken here today. We must all understand that not all Palestinians are terrorists. And it's important for us to understand that Israelis are a people whose deep suffering, confirmed today earlier in the week with the commemoration of Yom HaShoah, deserve their place as well. Thank you, Mr. President.
Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Rae. Now, the UN Security Council is being asked by the General Assembly to consider the matter favorably, as full membership must first be approved by the UN Security Council. Israel, for its part, is condemning the General Assembly's move. Well, as we reported on Thursday, the Angus Reid Institute released details of a new study this week, and it doesn't look very good for Canada's main party leaders. Aggregating both positive and negative impressions of Jagmeet Singh, Justin Trudeau, and Pierre Poilievre, and this is the net result. Negative impressions across the board, with the Institute saying there has never been a time when leaders of all three parties simultaneously turned Canadians off to such an extent. Well, to talk about this, we're now joined by Tonda MacCharles, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, Joël-Denis Bellavance, Ottawa Bureau Chief for La Presse, and Kristy Kirkup, Parliamentary Reporter for the Globe and Mail. Hello to the three of you.
Hey there. Hi.
Hello. So listen, I'm going to continue this thought, and this is the reasoning behind these negative numbers, according to the Angus Reid Institute. Take a listen. Many pundits and observers have speculated that politics has never been this divisive, with party leaders who seek to exploit differences rather than overcome them. Even Canadians have voiced concern that there is no room for compromise or that their voices aren't heard. This frustration and division appears to have created the perfect conditions for political dissatisfaction, and this has culminated demonstrated in historically unpopular leadership at the federal level. Again, that's from Angus Reid. Tonda, I'll get you to start us out. What do you make of that reasoning?
I think it's a bit more complicated than that. It's not just that there's political dissatisfaction because politics are polarized. I think politics have become polarized in large measure because essentially, you know, those numbers corresponded, they showed a certain correspondence of the decline of leadership ratings around the time when you saw Stephen Harper in power, Mulcair, Trudeau, sort of that dynamic happening, and they're going forward. But I think what really was going on there, the backdrop is the era of big social media, big data, big tech came along. And that drove all political parties to not just message differently as political parties within the House of Commons or Parliament or on mainstream media, but it drove different styles of fundraising and messaging on their own social media channels. And we're all aware of, excuse me, that's my phone. We're all aware of how that changed sort of the way politics is done in the House of Commons, you know, the drive for clips to put on social media, to drive clicks, to drive dollars to parties. And I think another thing that happened, and I'll wrap up on that, is sort of Canada moved away from a system that it experimented with for a few years of public financing for political parties, which took away the impetus to drive fundraising dollars all the time with negative messaging, which is more clickable and gets more reaction from people and voters, potential voters. So I think, look, it's a complicated picture. I absolutely agree. It's more divided now than I've ever seen it in my 25 years on Parliament Hill and more than 40 years reporting. And I think, though, there are a lot of reasons feeding into it. What I don't see is any political party leader addressing it by correcting their own behavior or their own party's behavior.
I'll pick up on that in a second, but first, what is your thought? This idea that Canadians are sick of all the leaders because they're sick of the partisanship?
Well, I think that should lead political leaders to ask themselves deep questions about their behavior and the kind of language they use, not only in the House of Commons, but when they address their own partisans. There used to be a time when you wouldn't call the Prime Minister a wacko. That shows a lot of disrespect for the institution, but also the person who occupies that institution. And if the person who actually worked with an institution shows such disrespect for one another, how can Canadians in their own end have some respect for the leadership that is actually in those institutions? So it's as we say in French, un couteau à double tranchant.
Double-edged sword.
Thank you so much. And it does cut a lot of people when you swipe it. So that's the end result, I think, are in those numbers.
Yeah, and thank you for saving us a bit on translation, the dollars there. Kristy, what do you make of it, though? Because, you know, without a doubt, we are dealing with some very partisan debate, and it doesn't, to Tonda's point, it seemed to be letting up at all.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I really, you know, I think ahead to the next election campaign, whenever that election is going to take place, likely the fall of 2025. And I don't see it getting any better. And I think that should be worrisome for everyone. I do agree with Joël-Denis that, you know, it is incumbent upon the political leaders and people within the political apparatus to try and kind of raise the bar in terms of the dialogue, the nature of respect that they're showing to one another. But I'm not trying to sound like an optimist today, or like I'm not an optimist, but, you know, I really see the situation deteriorating, and frankly, I'm not really sure how we come back from this.
And, you know, to that point, today there was an op-ed published by Charlie Angus, the outgoing NDP MP, and, you know, he's been in Parliament for 20 years, and he wrote very vividly about the threats that MPs are facing right now. And honestly, I read that, and, you know, I didn't need another reminder, but it just, again, made me think, like, I don't see how this doesn't end without someone getting seriously hurt. People are being driven to embrace very violent messaging, if I could say that. And some of the sort of the opposition and the sort of whatever means justifies or whatever end justifies the means, I think that we've got to be really concerned. We've seen it happen in many other democracies, and you know, I think we should take politicians at their word that they are seeing a level of threat against themselves that's not acceptable.
Yeah, but what's interesting about that, though, is, and I don't and this is not to point the finger at anyone, if someone leaves for whatever reasons, and if one of those reasons happen to be safety, who are we to criticize they're feeling endangered? But it's not as if those that are concerned can easily stand up, because the system seems to be even working against those who are on the Hill in the House of Commons who are trying to make it better. You're nodding your head there.
Yeah, I totally agree with your assessment of it. And Charlie Angus is one MP who's left with writing some letters to his constituents. But Pam Damoff, also a Toronto area MP, wrote a letter last week that ran in the Toronto Star and some other newspapers, and she laid out the same reasons why she's leaving politics. And I've learned that there will be new measures, security measures offered to MPs. And one of those will be that MPs in their own riding will be able to get police protection if they want it, and that will be paid by the House of Commons. And that should become announced in a few weeks, just to reassure those who are exercising that noble profession and those who would like to enter that profession. Because if we see people leaving, writing such letters saying that I don't feel secure in my own job, how can you attract other people to get into and try to get elected into office if you've got that atmosphere of insecurity to deal with? So that's a very bad problem we have on our hand right now as a democracy.
Yeah, as a democracy, and there have been past politicians who have spoken out about the lack of civility right now. In fact, when Brian Mulroney passed away, Joe Clark was actually sitting right here, and he put out a call saying we need to bring it down. We need to get back to the point where you can appreciate the difference in opinion, but not hate the person who's making the argument against you. And his concern is that at the end of the day, if this does not get under control, we're going to erode Canadian democracy, people's feelings for Canadian democracy, people's willingness to defend Canadian democracy. You covered the last campaign. What do you think about that?
I think that's really true, and I'll be honest with you, I think maybe that's why I sometimes think about going forward what the picture is going to look like in terms of what we're covering, and frankly, I think also the pushback against journalists as well. We certainly saw that during the course of the last election campaign. I traveled with Justin Trudeau for a bulk of that campaign. There was a lot of discussion at that time, of course, about COVID-19 vaccines. Some people were showing up at events who were really upset about that, and they were also palpably really upset with Justin Trudeau, which I kind of saw as a bit of a warm-up act, frankly, to the convoy that showed up on Parliament Hill that subsequent winter. The point being is that just the anger piece is just there towards Justin Trudeau, frankly, in such I think tangible way that it's hard to imagine again what that next campaign looks like because of the expletives that are being shouted at Justin Trudeau. That's not just it's not just something that a few people are saying. You can come across those types of bumper stickers now in the parking. I'm amazed at how often I'm actually seeing those types of bumper stickers and postcards. F Trudeau at the grocery store. I don't know how that happened, but it's kind of moved into I think the palpable anger against Trudeau is a big theme.
And the danger about that is that those who actually exploit that anger may peril afterwards because of that anger. They may suffer the same consequences. So it's you playing with fire. So I think that message should be heeded by some people who are actually exploiting that anger to their advantage. Because at one point, if you become the Prime Minister or you govern, you may suffer the same consequences as the one you are trying to achieve to your political opponent.
I don't think anybody's arguing for a lack of vigorous debate. I think that the House of Commons, twas ever thus, there was always vigorous debate there. And I've had people say to me, oh, well, there was always threats and there was always downplaying what's happening now. This is a different level. Those numbers show it. Everybody's experience of it here shows it. But that is not to say that policies can't be absolutely stripped down and governments called to account and opposition leaders demanded for their policies in return. I don't think anybody's arguing. We need that. That's what democracy really needs. But there's got to be a way to do it. No one would. I hope most parents wouldn't tolerate their children behaving like that to their friends, right? So.
Yeah, and yet this is the level, and I think that very much is a concern. But echoing what you said earlier, I don't know how this is brought back. I don't think it's brought back before the next election, which makes me wonder just how I guess the nice word is passionate, how heated and perhaps even dangerous it might become to cover some of these events and also to be part of it.
People are really worried about it. I think the police and the security people around the current political leadership is worried about it. I think the political leadership is worried about it. And I think a lot of observers are genuinely concerned that they don't know either. But that doesn't mean to say it's a lost cause. Some of this can be turned around. The temper of the times can be turned by discourse. If you want political discourse to be more civil, then make it more civil.
Okay, quickly running out of time. Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, it brings me to the 1988 election about free trade. That was a very passionate election, but it still remains civilized. I mean, most of the time, I would say. But still, I mean, that was a very passionate election. But at the end of the day, people voted and people respected the results. And then I think that's what should be. There are some people who should learn some lessons from that election
Brian
campaign.
Mulroney and John Turner were very friendly at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
And Kristy, last word to you.
You know, I think sometimes, especially I felt this during the last campaign, that in Canada, I feel like we really don't take these issues that seriously. It's like, oh, you know, even during 2021, it was, oh, well, people have always faced these types of threats. I think the reality is, and I think there's data to back it up, that the threats are evolving. And we have to, I think, you know, as a society, take a really hard look at this and actually take it seriously, because it's not just something that is happening in the United States, for example. It is happening here, and I'm glad we're talking about it, because it is an important part of the conversation of what is playing out in our democracy.
Well, I'm glad you're here to talk about it as well, Kristy. Thank you for this. And Tonda and Joël-Denis, as always, thank you to you.
Have a great weekend.
You too. The Bank of Canada released its financial stability report this week, noting that on inflation and any risk of a recession, the outlook is looking better. But there are still risks in the year ahead that could have a big impact on the financial system and the bottom line of every Canadian.
Over the past year, the risk of recession has diminished in Canada and globally. Inflation in most countries has come down, and inflation targets are in sight. However, there could be volatility in markets as expectations shift about when and by how much central banks will lower their policy rates. And there continue to be important geopolitical and economic risks on the horizon.
Well, to walk us through what we heard from the Bank of Canada, we're now joined by Mostafa Askari. He is Chief Economist with the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. Mostafa, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
So, you know, the preamble of this is that the financial system, according to the Bank of Canada, remains resilient. But they are pointing out to some of these pitfalls, worried that one shock to the system may create a greater shock to the whole system in its entirety. I'm wondering, is that particularly true of Canada because of the size of our economy and population?
I think it's true everywhere. I mean, if you have a household sector that is quite vulnerable, and if there is any real shock that, you know, we see significant amount of bankruptcy among the households, in fact, and people cannot pay out their mortgage, service their mortgage or their credit card, and that would obviously have impacts on how people consume, how people work, and all those things obviously could affect the other sectors of the economy, and that would be obviously a risk and an issue that, you know, people have to be aware of, and the governments, especially in financial institutions. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, you mentioned mortgages and credit cards, and not surprisingly, the top line of warnings, because there are a series of different red flags, but the largest red flag seems to be attached with mortgages. If the expectation is that interest rates will be going down at some point this year, why is that still such a concern?
Well, first of all, interest rates are not going to go down significantly. I mean, even the bank starts in June. If they start in June, it's going to be very gradual decline in interest rates. And we will never go back to the sort of the pandemic area interest rate. Those are just exceptional rates. So people who are going to redo their mortgages in the next couple of years, and they're going to probably have significant increases in their monthly payments. So that's a major risk. And although the bank says in the report that those who have already they have done their mortgages at a higher interest rate, they seem to be able to manage this by reducing their discretionary spending and increasing their savings. So, but still, it will be a big risk.
Big risk, as you say. And then the other has to do with credit cards. What's interesting about this is necessarily people have had to turn to credit cards because the past year or so has been very tough on them, and that's how they're making ends meet. And that is a red flag that the Bank of Canada is attaching to the Canadian economy writ large. Just how exposed are Canadians to risk because of their credit card holdings?
Well, it's a huge risk. I mean, the bank report actually says that those who have credit cards, they're not mortgage holders. These are just maybe renters, and they have credit cards. They have reached something like 80% of their credit amount that they can have, and their balances are that high. That kind of a high balance on credit cards with interest rates that are significant for credit cards in the 20% range, they are subject to significant amount of risk definitely. And how financial institutions and credit card companies are going to deal with that, that's an issue. Whether they're going to give them some room or not, that would be a question. But definitely that's significant. That's the part that was actually surprised me when I read the report, that it is that high. It is a big risk, there's no doubt.
I wonder what then, mortgage, credit cards, all this is consumer focused. So how should the average Canadian be reacting to this report? Again, because it's not that the Bank of Canada governor is saying that it's a horrible situation now. He's saying that it could be.
It could be, and what they're saying is that right now, as a sort of the general idea, when we look at the whole economy, there's no reason for panic. However, there are risks and there are vulnerabilities out there that people have to be aware of, the financial institutions have to be aware of, the governments have to be aware of, that those things can happen. They would affect the economy, then the government may have to respond. So yes, households definitely are being impacted more than anybody else, any other sector of the economy, because of high interest rate, high inflation at the same time. And hopefully, if the bank can bring inflation down, at least people can sort of plan on not prices going up significantly in the future.
So that was the Bank of Canada's analysis of the potential pitfalls of the year ahead. But again, I take what you're saying, that the rates may not fall as much as people would like it to, but there are indications that the rate will fall. There are indications that inflation is getting under control, and that the risk of recession keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So how much longer do Canadians almost have to hold their breath? Because that's been the position of many, just trying to stay afloat this past year and a half or so. How much longer is this going to last?
I think one of the issues is that I think during the period of very low interest rate, people maybe borrowed too much because interest rates were so low. They were buying homes that they probably, at the current rate, they cannot afford. And now the problem is that interest rate, even somebody who had a mortgage at 2%, now they have to do it at 4%, even if the interest rates go down. That's a double payment. So for many households, that would be significant and would be very hard to manage. And so they have to cut somewhere else, which means that their consumption will go down, and then that will affect the economy. And so we're going to go through that cycle.
So necessarily some deep thinking, rethinking perhaps on behalf of Canadians.
Yes, that's right. So I think over the next year or two, I don't think things are going to be very easy for households. And especially those with significant amount of leverage and debt on their balance sheet. So it would be difficult, no doubt.
Mostafa Askari, not a great note to end it on, but still a worthwhile thing to consider. Thank you for this. Appreciate the time.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
And that is the program. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back in 9 days' time. We hope to see you then. And until then, take care.